he's not the typical sneaker endorser. And even he said it himself. He's like, hey, this thing could go either way, you know, and if it goes horribly wrong, I'll use it as a joke in my old age. Like, remember when I thought I could have a sneaker? So he was sort of hedging. But I wrote to him and you know, I wrote info at Gary V or whatever it was and made it a really concise pitch, which said something like, hey, I believe that entrepreneurs are the new heroes of youth culture, and athlete, the idea of playing for the Yankees is a bit old fashioned. And I think you're the face of that. How about we make the first signature sneaker for an entrepreneur? That was it.
Podcasting from Boulder, Colorado. This is the Baby Got Backstory podcast, where we dive into the story behind the story of today's most inspiring storytellers, creators, and entrepreneurs. I like big backstories, and I cannot lie. I am your host, Mark Gutman. I'm Mark Gutman, and on today's episode of Baby Got Backstory, how a software executive from England arrived in Los Angeles and revived one of the most iconic sneaker brands in the world. And before we get to today's show, I want to deliver a heartfelt thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I feel so lucky to be doing something I love and that is appreciated by you, the listener. Without listeners, does a podcast really exist? Channeling my inner Stephen right there. And I want to thank you for taking the time to listen and absorb these amazing stories. I truly believe that stories shape our world and that the very best way we can connect with our fellow humans, find meaning in this thing that we call life, is through stories. But even more, when we're invited into someone else's story, it has this amazing effect. Just like when we travel to foreign lands and realize that those people across the globe, the ones that we thought were so weird or evil or strange or different or don't share our values or our beliefs, we find that they are just like us and that we have so much in common. And that bonds us as humans. And that delivers empathy to our fellow human beings and makes the world right again. Now, if you like and enjoy the show, please take a minute or two to rate and review us over at iTunes. iTunes uses these as part of the algorithm that determines ratings on the Apple charts, and ratings help us to build an audience, which then helps us to continue to produce this show. And lastly, this show is all about creating value for you, as well as opening up a dialogue. I realize I'm doing all the talking, but please, let's start the conversation. I am at Mark Gutman on all social channels, primarily Insta, LinkedIn, and Facebook, not a real active Twitter user. And you can always send an email to podcast@wildstory.com with your thoughts and comments. We love feedback. I read all those emails personally and I will respond. And if you have any great ideas for guests, let me know. I want to know who you want to hear me interview. And now, on to today's show. I love sneakers and shoes, and it probably comes out of being raised in a skate and snow culture as a kid where cool sneakers were everything. And when I put on an awesome pair of sneakers, I feel amazing and cool and, dare I say, hip. When I put on a pair of shiny dress shoes, I feel, well, like a banker. No offense to bankers. But as you'll hear today's guest explain, I think that perception and paradigm of who is wearing sneakers is changing. I love shoes so much that when we did a home remodel a couple of years ago, the only thing I fought for was the shoe shelf in my closet. It's now lined with sneakers, mostly simple and Vans, a couple of Nike, Adidas, and recently a pair of KSWISS. KSWISS is a one-story brand that found itself in decline and is finding its way back to relevance. I remember growing up as a kid in Detroit when the shockingly all-white KSWISS seemed to become the shoe of choice out of nowhere. Then over the years, it just sort of disappeared. They tried to bring the brand back to relevance with some super funny commercials starring Kenny Powers as the new CEO. But as you'll hear today's guest explain, great story, off-brand. Enter Barney Waters. Barney is a savvy marketer and brand builder, and now the CEO of KSWISS. And he now has KSWISS on the right path back to relevancy and profitability. And on today's episode, Barney will talk about how K-Swiss found its differentiator, how K-Swiss landed the Michael Jordan of the entrepreneur world, and how he identified the white space that is allowing K-Swiss to once again become a profitable brand. And now, Barney Water and K-Swiss. All right, Barney, we're here to talk about your ascension as up to the president of K-Swiss and some of the really innovative and amazing things you're doing with that brand. But before we get there, I'd like to go back a ways and maybe go back a little bit to the beginning. I understand that you grew up in England, and I think most of our listeners will understand that as soon as they hear you speak as well. But were you always into shoes?
I guess I was, yes. I think growing up, I was into what was hot and what was not, whether that was, clothes, shoes, music. I had a great group of friends that I grew up with, and we were always into, what was, making sure you had the right gear on. And that definitely included sneakers. So I always used to buy sneakers. I was always into sneakers. Never really dreamt it would become my profession, but, being able to have done that has really made a big impact in my life to be able to show up every day to work and really be passionate about what I'm doing.
Yeah. And do you have a concrete memory of that first time that switch kind of flipped for you from being someone who just, consumed brands to someone who really started to look at them a little bit differently and say, oh, like there's something here. There's something more to this idea of what a brand is rather than me just being a consumer and kind of falling into my tribe or what have you?
Yeah, I think it's when I made the shift in my career from software into sneakers. And that was when I moved to the States. I was working in the software industry, and I was able to move to the sneaker industry, both in a marketing capacity. But I think once I got into the sneaker business, brand became much more important to the consumer. So what our brand stood for and how our brand communicated and what the brand represented in that customer's life when it's sneakers versus software is a lot more important. So I think that was probably when I started to learn the importance of brand attaching to a product more so probably than in the software business.
Yeah, so let's go back there. You're in the software business. That's sort of a different path than going down this later route and this later chapter of being a brand builder. What were you doing there and thinking about that career? What brought you into software?
Well, I was originally I thought I wanted to be a sales guy. My dad was a salesman, and people used to say I had the gift of the gab, as we said in England, which you could talk to anyone and sell anything. So I thought I wanted to be a salesman, and I did telephone sales. That's what I did to start with. And I would, be cold calling people and selling them computer equipment. And I hated it. I just didn't like being just the guy on the end who was trying to push something on people who usually didn't want it. And I was actually lucky to move to a great company called Lotus, which was a software company, makers of Lotus 123 and Lotus Notes. And they moved the inside sales team into the marketing department. So I kind of fluked my way into marketing at that point and fell in love with it. And that's when I became a marketer versus sales. And, that's how I got into that line of work.
Yeah. And so, I think, we talk about this a lot, and you might even talk about this on your podcast, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But, most businesses, in my opinion, and we talk about on the show, are really born out of inspiration, frustration, or desperation. And even this changing career for you of moving on, if I heard you correctly, you said, look, I got into sales and I hated it. And so that really, is a frustration or a desperation move to make a change. You get into marketing. What struck you about marketing? What did you love about it?
Well, I just love the fact that you're actually, you're sort of the chess player. You're the one who's sort of scheming and calculating and trying to read the market and put together the plan. And I like that. I like the sort of behind the scenes plotting and the puzzle solving, I guess, was what I think of with marketing, is how well can you understand the consumer and how well can you create the product and the story to connect those two, the consumer need with your product solution. That's the puzzle you have to figure out. And I always like that idea of being, not necessarily the soldier running out into the field with the gun, but being the guy in the tent looking at the map. That's sort of how I visualize it, I suppose.
I love that analogy and the chess player. That's perfect. I agree with you. I prefer to do that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you left the software business, what was that first company you went to that brought you here to the States?
Well, I moved to the States with Lotus, the software company, and it was a great company, and I learned a ton and some great people, and it was a dynamic company, but it ended up getting bought by IBM, which is like working for the government. And that just drove me crazy. I just really sort of sucked all the life out of and energy out of the company, I felt. And I was lucky enough to get an opportunity to go work at Puma, which was a sneaker brand that was really just on the up. And it was just becoming a huge trending fashion sneaker. And I got on right at the perfect time. And it was just an absolute joy. It was so fun, so successful. And everything we were doing was really, relevant to culture, youth culture and fashion and style and celebrity and entertainment and sports. And it was just a great time. And that I did that as head of marketing for Puma. I ended up becoming head of marketing for Puma for North America for about 7 years.
Yeah, and you really helped to build that brand, and then you have an opportunity to move on. That must have been a little bit of a difficult choice, and I'm guessing maybe you wanted another challenge, or if there's something different, you can share that as well. But is this when you went to Palladium?
Exactly. Yes. I mean, Puma was so great, but ultimately I was sort of implementing the global strategy in the North American region. That was my job. So, I had a seat at the table for some of those plans, but I wasn't really controlling it. And I felt like I was at a point where I wanted to see what I could do myself. And so I had an opportunity to go really build a brand. It was a comeback story with Palladium, but it had gone away, almost entirely outside of a couple of European countries. And I thought it was my chance to put myself to the test to see what I could do, in building a brand. And I just didn't feel like those opportunities would come along very often. So I went for it, and that's what moved me out to California. And it was a brand that had just been purchased by KSWISS. So we were a subsidiary of KSWISS, and there's about 4 people that were rebuilding Palladium, and I did that for 4 years.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. I think, I talk to a lot of marketers, and they really think that, if I only had the budget of a Puma, or if I only, had a job at a Nike or a Puma, that I'd be able to do all these things. And the fact that really you were there to implement and execute on their plan, and it wasn't as maybe creative or didn't have the freedom maybe that some other roles have. I think it's just a really interesting insight.
Yeah, no question about that. I think unless you're, and look, I had a lot of freedom, but not ultimate decision making, I guess. So I think I was in the right role for the time I was there, and I wasn't probably ready to do more but most of the years I was there. But at the end, I was ready to do more. Yeah, I think if you get into these big companies, you have the benefit of learning from everyone around you, because they're probably pretty good people around you, but you do become a bit of a specialist. You're either focused on social media or focused on PR or athlete endorsement or whatever the piece of the puzzle is. When you get into a smaller company or a startup or something more entrepreneurial, you do touch everything. And that's a huge advantage, I think, is to be able to get that exposure to many more pieces of the pie and to not have this big sort of hierarchy above you of decision makers, which can be frustrating for people with certain types of characters who prefer to be fast decision making.
Yeah. And so if I'm connecting the dots, you come into Palladium, which is a subsidiary of K-Swiss, and then you work your way up to your current role today, which is president of K-Swiss, the K-Swiss, the athletic shoe line, correct?
That's right. Yep.
Cool. And then so, I remember K-Swiss as a kid, and it had this really interesting sort of place, at least the way I perceived it. And this is just my, perception of it is when I was younger, was it had this this athletic component, tennis, but it really was a fashion sneaker. And I grew up in the Detroit area. And so you can imagine it was a very, at times urban hip hop kind of fashion sneaker. And, but why don't you start off, if you will, just telling us a little bit about the history of K-Swiss and where we're at today, and we can take it from there.
Yeah, well, it was two Swiss brothers who founded the company. They moved from Switzerland in the 60s, and they were skiers. And they realized that skiing and ski boots were designed for lateral side-to-side motion, which skiing is. You need tight fit for side-to-side movement. And they realized that tennis was the same thing. It was a sport that was played from side to side. And they figured, hey, what if we took the design elements of ski boots and applied them to tennis sneakers? We could make a really great tennis sneaker. And that's what they did. And so they moved to California in 1966 and created a shoe called the K-Swiss Classic, which is still today our best-selling shoe. And it was a white leather tennis shoe for playing tennis in. And that's, over 50 years ago. And in fact, they only made the K-Swiss Classic for 20 years. So the second shoe they made came out in 1986. And now we have a full line of sneakers, but still anchored around this idea of this more casual, what we call court style. So tennis history, but more casually worn with jeans. And that's the business we have today. About 10% of our business is real tennis shoes for playing tennis, and 90% is casual sneakers for wearing with jeans or whatever. But as you correctly said, the brand really peaked in early 2000s around hip hop culture when jeans got baggier. And so you needed a bigger kind of sneaker to fit that same profile of the pants. And K-Swiss was making these chunky white sneakers, and it just got huge and became the number 2 brand at Foot Locker behind Nike at its heyday.
Its heyday. And where do you sit now, or how do you see your position now in the marketplace?
Well, trends then shifted. So as they always do, trends shifted and things got profile of pants changed and sneaker trends changed. In fact, I think around that time when I was joining Puma, and Puma was making really brightly colored, low profile European fashion sneakers. It was almost the polar opposite to white, chunky American sneakers. So the trend shifted and K-Swiss was sort of left out in the cold, so to speak. And then it's probably taken that long for trends to sort of turn around again. And now you find that 90s and the early 2000s, that sort of retro athletic type product is really hot again. And that's helped propel us in our quest to bring this brand back to relevance. And that's essentially what I started doing in 2016 as I took over as the president of K-Swiss, was to try and bring the brand back to life, as it had suffered through many years of decline and losing money. And we're sort of going to end this year profitable and with double-digit growth. So far, so good, but a long way to go.
Well, congratulations. I mean, as entrepreneurs, we don't often celebrate our successes. So I just want to take a moment and say that's fantastic and congratulations. And
yeah,
so, that brings a really interesting question to mind. Like when you look at a brand and you're like, all right, we have this great brand story. We have this legacy. There's something here. We know there's something here, but the market certainly isn't responding at the time. Like, what's the first thing you do to bring a brand back to relevance? Like, how did you approach that?
Well, I think you have to, we did a lot of things, tactically, we did a lot of things around, cutting costs and refining processes and things of that nature. So that part can't be underestimated. But it's not the fun part, obviously. But we did all of that stuff as well. But you've got to change a lot of people and get new energy and change offices, and we'd had to do a lot of things to really get the energy shifted into a new direction. But then we honed back in on the original history of the company. So I felt like, and I said this a lot at the time, that K-Swiss seemed like a car that had been resprayed multiple times. It'd been tried to be a lot of different things to save itself. And I felt like we needed to get all that old paint off and find out what the original color was and start there. So we sort of got it back down into a heritage American tennis brand. And so in fact, we sort of specialized again to get a wedge back in the market was the first strategy, was to say, let's cut more things than we add and boil it down. And at the time, there were these first signs of white sneakers being on trend again, and people weren't wearing white sneakers at all at this time. But there was these sort of murmurings. A lot of women in Paris at Paris Fashion Week had been wearing an old Adidas sneaker called the Stan Smith as a casual sneaker, and they had been on the front row at the Fashion Week shows. And so there was a buzz around these sort of retro white sneakers. So at the same time that we specialized back into our original heritage lane, that lane was showing signs of becoming popular again. So I think we caught that moment and honed in at the right time to give ourselves a wedge to get something working again. And then, once you get some small thing working, you can then build off of that over the next, which we did. We then built off of that over the next 2 years to get ourselves where we are now.
Yeah, and that's super interesting to me because we talk to a lot of really kind of strong, iconic founders, and it's really easy for them to tell the story or to get people to connect to their story. But coming into someone else's story, that seems like an interesting challenge, and getting back to that, as you termed it, that first layer of paint, and really remembering who you are and building on that. And I just bring that up to kind of point out the importance of connecting with that backstory, whether it's yours or it's someone else's that started the company. But we have to connect with something and know who we are at some point, and that's really interesting.
Yeah, and what you have to do is you have to look at all the pieces that you have, and you've got to be, how do I tell this? It's all storytelling again, but it's how do I put all these pieces together and tell the story the most interesting and concise way possible? Like sometimes you write a sentence and you think, okay, what can I take? The best writers take a sentence and say, what can I take out of this to say the same thing in fewer words? And it's almost like this constant reduction until you get the most concise, compelling way of saying something. And that's essentially what you're doing when you're trying to tell brand stories is, okay, I've got 1966. I've got these guys who came over to make a tennis shoe in California. White sneakers are trending. These are all the pieces. And I realized that it really came down to 3 words, which was heritage American tennis. And when we did that, say we're an old brand, we're a tennis specialist, and we were founded in California. So heritage American tennis, we were the only heritage American tennis brand in the sneaker world. So we also gave ourselves something, we were unique. Then I went to retailers and said, hey, we're a heritage American tennis brand. And they all sort of nodded. Yeah, we know that. And that fits. And that sounds about right. And I said, hey, you're hearing the white sneaker trend is coming, right? And everyone was like, yeah, that's the buzz of the industry. And I said, okay, well, if white sneakers are the next big thing and we're the only heritage American tennis brand, then you got to have us in the mix. And, I batted 1,000 on that. Everyone went, yeah, let's see the shoes.
That's awesome. Yeah.
But the exercise was really, you could have gone 1,000 different ways with the pieces of the puzzle on the table, but we put the right ones together that was authentic to what we really were, but also critically that they lined up against the market opportunity. I could have told a great story about how we're the number one, mesh running shoes, for marathons. But if that wasn't what the market was buying, then have a great story that's irrelevant in terms of selling shoes. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's gold right there, Barney. Thank you. I mean, we have a billion stories, right? And I think, one of the questions I get all the time is, what story do I tell? And I think you just gave a lot of people that answer.
Yeah, timing is so critical. There's thematics. Even if you look at society today and politics and the news, okay, themes are bubbling up every day and then they're going away again. They ebb and flow of themes. And there's certain things happening in society now that if you wrote a book now about something, maybe it's immigration or something about a family's journey to America. Okay, it's going to be way more topical now than if you did that, a few years ago, or maybe even in 6 months' time. So it's also about not only telling a great story, but lining up the timing to when you can have the most impact. And I think that's probably the exercise that worked for us when looking back 2 years ago.
Yeah. And so I wanted to ask, do you do that as an actual exercise, or is it more abstract for you, just having your pulse on the zeitgeist of what's going on? Or do you, as a team, literally get in a room and say, hey, what's going on right now? And how do we connect with these different plot points of present day?
constantly doing that. And I think you have to be constantly ear to the ground in whatever industry you're in. And you're looking for, so how do I stay up on what's going on? Is just like I'm consuming it all day, every day, whether I'm in a sneaker company surrounded by professional sneaker people. So all we do is talk about this stuff and we're all passionate fans of it. So we're not talking about it in a scientific way. We're talking about it because we love it, and we're visiting sneaker stores and we're looking at the right websites and blogs and we're sort of consuming culture. And I think that's really important that you're doing that. And that's why it's good to align your career with something you believe in, because then that's effortless. It's like if I was in the pet food business, it'd be hard for me to research pets all day if I'm not into animals, So I'm lucky that that's a natural thing. And then at the same time, there are some scientific ways of doing it as well, or not scientific, but there's other ways, like you can you can read obviously a lot of reports about where things are going and trend of market share data and things like that. And in our industry, you can also look at apparel trends as signifiers of things that could have an influence on footwear. We found that pants and leg wear has an influence on shoes because it has been proven recently with the growth of women wearing yoga pants casually. The denim business really suffered. Lululemon took off, but what that also did is it made women buy a lot more athletic running shoes to fit with the pants. So in that case, the pant was what really was the canary in the coal mine that signaled a change in sneakers. And that's happened many times before, where people wearing skinny jeans really was in concert with people wearing Converse Chuck Taylors and them taking over the market. Because again, those profiles of the pants and the shoes fit together. So if you extrapolate that over time, you can almost watch pant trends as an indicator of what's coming next in footwear in terms of shape and silhouette.
Well, and I've noticed that all the young people around us are now pegging their jeans and wearing acid wash styles once again. So,
that's right. So, just applying that to other industries is, you can look at your industry, but there might be other indicators that you could look at to signify change coming and keep an eye on those as well.
I love it. I just imagine maybe at KSWISS, you guys have like the pant profile index up on the wall or something, right? And it's like almost like the stock exchange, but like where the pant styles going and, what's the ticker look like?
That's right.
So you've gone on and you did some, I think very savvy and smart business things. You mentioned the things that weren't as fun, but then, KSWISS as of late has done some actually very fun things when it comes to branding and marketing. One that comes to mind is the Kenny Powers ads that you ran. Were you involved with those, or was that?
No, and that was really just before my time. And I think, looking back, that was a huge, impactful campaign in terms of the viewership, but it didn't save the company. It didn't convert to sales. It was huge eyeballs and virality, but didn't really make a difference on the bottom line.
Yeah, and I think that's so important to point out that we do so many things as marketers, as branders. If it's not aligned with the people that are our core demographic and the people that we're going to sell to and connect with, again, you're going to have great viral videos. People are going to ask you about it on podcasts, but it doesn't affect your numbers.
Yeah, and look, product sales and marketing have to be aligned. In other words, if marketing creates an amazing campaign and gets a ton of eyeballs, and then that consumer goes to the mall at the weekend, but there's no K-Swiss shoes in the stores, then that brand awareness cannot be converted to a sale. So you've got to be careful that marketing isn't generating demand that can't be fulfilled because sales hasn't been aligned on the plan. And that happens a lot in big companies where those three entities are operating independently. They have to be aligned and on the same page. And I think if I went back and, it's easy to look at after the fact, but if I critiqued, the K-Swiss before my time of that Kenny Powers thing, that's probably what I would say could be improved in it.
Yeah, and that's a great kind of change of direction, or at least I'll build on that a little bit because, doing my pre-show research and everything, the next big campaign that came for K-Swiss that everyone's talking about right now is your relationship with Gary Vaynerchuk and this Generation K campaign and targeting sneakers to CEOs and entrepreneurs, and that and then in lockstep with that, just talking about that consistency and alignment, you've launched a podcast on K-Swiss Radio called CEOs Wear Sneakers. So that's all nicely aligned. And so let's go there. Tell me about, again, I have this vision of you sitting in a room doing your typical branding chart with your XY axis, plotting who owns what, where is Nike, where is Adidas, Puma, Reebok, and there's this big white space and it says entrepreneurs. And Barney's like, we got some white space. But exactly. That's my version. I'd love to hear your version.
Well, that's pretty much that's sort of how it went down but it took a lot longer than that. But essentially that was the plan, or that was the move, which is I just felt like we couldn't win if we tried to sign athletes and make better running shoes than the 10 running brands already out there. It just didn't make sense to me, and K-Swiss was making running shoes at the time. And that's one of the first things I did is said, we're getting out of that running business because we're not going to be better than Asics and Brooks and Mizuno and Reebok, Saucony, Nike, Under Armour, Reebok. I've just named God knows how many without even getting to the others. So I just thought that's not going to be where we can win. And also it wasn't K-Swiss's authentic heritage either. So even when you do it, the consumer and the retailer's looking at you like, K-Swiss running? Really? Well, when you say tennis, they're like, oh yeah, that's what we thought you were. It's really hard to shift somebody's perception. I mean, that's probably one of the things about having an older brand is the good news is that people really like and trust in the longevity of a brand. The downside is, you've got this baggage because it's hard to change the perception of that brand because that perception of the brand resides in somebody else's mind, not in yours. In other words, it doesn't matter what I think it is, it matters what the consumer thinks it is. And for me to get into their head and change something is so difficult. So I think, you are what you are, and it's really hard to try and change it into something else. So K-Swiss as a running brand or a sports brand, I just felt was unwinnable. And then what Adidas had done was started to sign rappers, and they changed the game a little bit by kind of going away from sports, which was always the sneaker formula was sneaker plus athlete. And Adidas started to sign, realize that these rappers and entertainers and celebrities were the new heroes, and they stole a lot of attention. And I realized I couldn't win by doing that either, because my budget isn't going to sign somebody who's better than Kanye for Adidas. So by signing a small budget rapper, I would have looked like a small budget brand. So it was really about competitive differentiation was the reason we jumped into the entrepreneur thing, along with the fact that it really was happening. It wasn't just again, it's like you can come up with an open lane, but if that lane isn't got any traffic on it, there's no point going down it. But so on the one hand, we realized entrepreneurship was open. And the second thing we realized was that it was really happening. And it didn't take much looking to realize that, as you know yourself, everyone I talk to, no one's ever said like, no, I don't believe that's true. Everyone's gone, yeah, that's what young people are trying to be now. So I think we just hit a really, a lot of things came together, which was this lane was open. It kind of fit the brand because we were from tennis. So that's a sort of aspirational country club, high-end sport. So it wasn't a stretch to be in entrepreneurship. I almost felt like the old K-Swiss world was the country club of the dark wood paneling, and the modern K-Swiss world is like a WeWork, which is like the modernization of that country club vibe. So, it sort of dovetailed the heritage and the modern. And that spark is what's carried us, and we've just jumped right into that. It's taken us a while to sort of get everybody on board and bring it to life. And then obviously Gary V was our Jordan, if you talk about Nike with athletes, and he's really brought this thing to life.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk about Gary V and kind of how you got him aboard. But before we do that, I mean, when you were So this is the kind of thing like everyone can go, this makes total sense. It's totally obvious in hindsight now that you're doing it and you're executing on it so well. But I mean, was there a moment where you were just looking around and had this like cinematic movie moment where you're looking around maybe at a WeWork or at a conference and you see all these young CEOs, all these entrepreneurs wearing sneakers and the light bulb goes off?
Well, yeah, actually, funny enough, there was a moment that I can remember where and there was a lot of them, but there's one I really remember, there was a trade show called the Agenda Trade Show in Long Beach, which was a B2B show for the surf skate industry, and a lot of sneaker brands show there. And they have a side event where some speakers would do, keynotes. And they have different CEOs from sneaker companies or streetwear brands or surf companies speak. And I remember, I can't remember who was speaking. I think it was the CEO of Stance Socks. And I looked around the audience and there were all these young skate kids. And they were like, some of them had their skateboards with them. And they were, not only were they sitting in an auditorium listening to basically a keynote speech, but they were taking notes. They're like taking notes as they listened. And I just thought, well, this is it. These do not look like student types who are interested in business, but here they are, not only being in the room, but taking notes. I thought, this is it. This is happening right in front of my eyes.
So cool. I love thinking of that moment. And thank you for painting that picture. So let's talk about, I also would love to hear the story about how you went out and got your Jordan. I mean, Gary Vaynerchuk is not someone who has a ton of time, and he's not, was he receptive immediately to your outreach? Was he like, who's this Barney guy, asking me about sneakers?
He was very receptive because I was offering him a signature sneaker. And I mean, there's not going to be many people who wouldn't want to do that. So with the hindsight, I'm like, I had a really good offer. And he was very busy, but he was not the same level that he is today. I'm going back to, I think he had 600,000 followers on Instagram back then. And now he has 4.5 million or maybe 5 million. So he was not the Gary Vee he is today, but he was definitely still the only guy I could really, that kept bubbling up in my feed as being the guy talking about entrepreneurship and married with youth culture, doing it in a cool way. And I just was really struggling to find someone who was an authentic entrepreneur, but also a cool, aspirational person for young people. It's easy to find one or the other, but it was very hard to find both. And even then, I'm just like thinking, man, this Gary Vee guy is the guy, but he's not the typical sneaker endorser. And even he said it himself. He's like, hey, this thing could go either way, and if it goes horribly wrong, I'll use it as a joke in my old age. Like, remember when I thought I could have a sneaker? So he was sort of hedging. But I wrote to him and I wrote info at Gary Vee or whatever it was and made it a really concise pitch, which said something like, hey, I believe that entrepreneurs are the new heroes of youth culture, and athletes, the idea of playing for the Yankees is a bit old fashioned. And I think you're the face of that. How about we make the first signature sneaker for an entrepreneur? That was it. And his team responded right away. And he responded. Actually, his team responded, said, let's set up a meeting. And then I got an email from Gary about an hour later, and it was just a smiley face emoticon.
Talk about concise, right?
Yeah. And it's funny because Gary since said, I've heard him say that he can't remember the last time he wrote in the body of an email. Well, just like the subject line. He operates in like really small increments. Like if he books a meeting, it could be like 6 minutes scheduled.
I need to take a lesson from that for sure. And
yeah,
that's so incredible. And so how long did it take you to actually, when you reached out to Gary and started the collaboration, like how long does it take to actually produce a sneaker like that?
Well, if you're designing ground up sneakers, it can take a long time. If you're already designing from the bottom up, it could take 18 months once you've factored in, producing it, selling it, the whole 9 yards. That's so long now, and in a culture which wants immediate satisfaction, and trends are shifting so fast. If a meme comes out this afternoon, someone's got a T-shirt available tomorrow. So everyone's had to shrink their timelines down in other industries to keep up with what's happening out there. So, but even for us, a fast sneaker that's just a different color up of an existing style, could be 3 months, 3 to 6 months to produce them and get them shipped over here. So it can take some time. But in the case of Gary, I mean, it was probably under a year before we had the shoe ready to go.
Yeah. And how did you know it was going to, that it was a success? I mean, as you mentioned, you and Gary are thinking, this could go either way. And you launch, and what happens?
Well, actually what happened was, first of all, we launched it at midnight, which was, it was 9 Pacific. And I remember that I was in New York, so it was midnight, and the site crashed at 12:01. So as soon as the thing went live, the traffic killed our website, and which was shocking and also not a good look for us. And then by 12 p.m. the next day, so within 12 hours, we'd sold everything. It was gone.
And are you sitting around just thinking like, I can't believe this? Or are you thinking, I knew this would happen?
I felt like I told you so to everyone. Because I've been, it was like validation of what I've been saying for so long, that I felt like this was the right thing to do, and that there was something here, and this was the guy. And I think, there were so many reservations. I think even, that was my instinct, was like, you see, we were right. I knew it, or something along those lines. But that may have been 50% relief.
I love it. And so you've been validated, this is a space you're going to play, you have your podcast, which is really cool. The tagline in the description talks about how the KSWISS team talks to CEOs, entrepreneurs, and go-getters who inspire us to hustle hard and to reach our potential. Yeah. We find out how they did it and the lessons learned along the way. So that seems like an amazing channel, an amazing way to connect through entrepreneurs. What else are you doing with KSWISS? Are you looking to sign additional entrepreneur athletes, or entre-athletes, maybe we can coin the term?
Yeah. It's funny you should say that, because there's such parallels. I remember I grabbed a pair of Gary's sneakers that he was switching sneakers for a video. And I said, can I have the ones you just took off? Because, because I was calling them game worn. Which is such an athletic term. I mean, these are game-worn Gary V sneakers, so there's such parallels now. It's funny. But, CEOs Wear Sneakers, the podcast, is really us contributing to the culture of entrepreneurship, not selling sneakers on it, but just, inspiring people by showcasing young entrepreneurs who is our consumer target or our consumer muse. And I think brands have to do that. You can't just be about the product and the sell these days. You've got to add value beyond the product and stand for something. And I think the CEOs Wear Sneakers podcast is an effort to do that. And CEOs Wear Sneakers as a name just is sort of saying things have changed. People who run companies now are not old white people in suits. They could be anyone, multi-gender, multi-racial, multi-age. And that's the beauty of it, is that anybody could be a CEO. You can't tell by what they wear. And in many cases, or what they look like. And in many cases, they're wearing jeans and sneakers. So that's CEOs Wear Sneakers. But also the idea of podcasting and me being on podcasts like this and some of the video content we create is about brand transparency, which is another theme I think that is bit of an expectation these days for any business. Is people want to know like who you are and what you stand for. And, the companies can't really be faceless anymore. And so we're trying to be as transparent as possible, as I think that could set us apart from some of our bigger competition, who would have a harder time being able to do that, just because of that internal structure and politics and hierarchy of being in a bigger business. You've got bigger responsibilities. For us, we can be really nimble and make quick decisions like, hey, let's make a video about what we're doing here and stick it on YouTube, which is what we've done.
Yeah, and I think it's really cool. And, I love that while your title's president, and you talked about, hey, I had to go in, I had to do a lot of the not fun president stuff, like cost cutting and, managing the financials and things like that. But I noticed that you do a ton of brand building yourself. And I think that really is, what you're talking about, that brand transparency. Most brands, the president can't, be on a podcast, can't be, either appearing or hosting their own. They can't be doing all these things where they are very visible in the business from a brand building perspective. And I just get the sense that, and I think you mentioned that you love marketing and that you love this process of brand building and being involved in it.
Yeah. And I think these days, branding is becoming much more important for companies. I just feel like we always pick our presidents or CEOs from the commercial side, either the CFO or the head of sales. And, brand is probably the most important thing now because, there's parity in features and functions. Anyone can make anything now, right? So I could make a great toothbrush tomorrow and put it online and have a Shopify site or toothpaste or jelly or anything. So once you have the ability, like distribution is now open to anyone, reaching an audience is open to anyone through social, and building product is open to anyone, then the only differentiator is going to be your brand. So I feel like branding is raised in importance. And so if you're not a company that is solidifying what your brand stands for and building what your brand stands for and then communicating that, then you're going to be in trouble because someone's going to come along and make the same product as you, and they're going to do it faster, cheaper, or better. They're going to cut out wholesale and do it direct to consumer, and you're going to be a dinosaur. So I feel like branding, if you're branding people out there, I would feel like you should not hide that. That should be a badge of honor right now. But I think you're going to become strategically a lot more important.
Yeah. And, and I don't know if this is, something you've consciously done, but again, I just pick up on the fact that you really align with Gary V's clouds in the dirt philosophy as well, that, you're running this business, you're doing a lot of the things that you have to do from a visionary standpoint, but you're also, in the dirt, like building the brand, yes, appearing on the podcast and working really hard. And I think that, as an extended lesson of what it means to build a brand, I think that's a really great example. And I don't know if that was a conscious decision prior to, if that's the way you've always been, or if, you picked that up, with Gary.
Yeah, I think I've always been that way. And I think also this is like a startup. We're not some big fat company that's, over-resourced and tons of money. We're fighting tooth and nail every day to, sell every pair of shoes. So we have to be, have our sleeves rolled up and doing multiple jobs because we're a challenger brand that's fighting for its future, so the same as any startup or entrepreneurial company is doing. So I think that's probably true of us as well. We just have an old company name that people recognize. So maybe it's assumed that we're, have more resources than we do. And I think we'll get back to there, no question. But right now we're in a all hands on deck mode. And then, I struggle with the idea of myself being the host of the podcast or on video or, how much should it be about me? And I think it should be about us, not just me. And hopefully other people are on our platforms from our company that people get to know as well. But, I think this is what can separate us. I feel like it's a competitive advantage that we should use. It's like being small can be a disadvantage, but how do you turn that into an advantage? And that is by saying, well, look, we can be much more transparent than our bigger competition. So now we've made our size an advantage, not a disadvantage. And by doing that is by us being able to speak out and for us to get people to know who we are. And if you write to me on Instagram, I'll probably write you back, and if you put a comment on our LinkedIn, we'll probably respond to you. And that's different than a lot of other brands. So, and who our people are now because you may have watched our YouTube show or you may have listened to our podcast. And I think that's an advantage.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it's a complete advantage to have that connectivity and that human connection. People really crave that more and more. And, so many times, even like, I don't know if you ever had this happen, but like sometimes I'll send a prospecting email, much like the one you sent to Gary V, like, hey, I've got this idea, blah, blah, blah. And someone will be like, is this a bot? Like, or take me off your list. I'm like, no, like this is actually me. But everyone is so afraid, right, of this lack.
Yeah. And I always use this phrase like, why not me? Why not? Give me a better reason why. There's fewer reasons why not than there are about what the benefit is. It's like, it's okay to be confident and to go for it, and I definitely think Gary has shown us the way there. And without sort of blowing too much smoke at Gary, is like, he's evidence of how this can work and the benefit of doing it, as long as it's genuine and as long as you're providing value and not just being like, hey, it's the me show, but like, hey, let me bring you something, or let me interview someone that I think you're going to find fascinating, and let me pull the lessons out that could maybe add some value to you. I just had someone just email me the other day and said, hey, I did a speech at an event, and the event organizer said, well, I just got this email from someone who said, based on Barney's speech, we aligned a lot of the lessons from that speech into the business we just created, and we've just done $600,000 of sales based on a lot of those principles around competitive positioning and branding. I was like, that was amazing. I never would have thought that, So if you can do that, then why not do it?
Yeah. I hope you charged a lot for that speech. That was a lot
No, I don't.
Because a lot of value.
No, I definitely don't, because I feel like that would be crossing a line. I'm not. That's definitely not. If I'm going to do it, I do it for free.
Yeah. And so, you've been incredibly successful. This is a great, what I'd call American turnaround story of this brand. And you've talked a lot about the successes, but like, what's really hard about building a brand? Like, what don't we know?
Well, it's hard to fail. It's hard to not be good. And we had spent a lot of time with a brand that was struggling, and it's tough. It's tough to motivate your team when the results are not good. You're selling future potential versus what's happening right now. It's hard to retain talent when you're not successful. You have to change personnel in many cases, whether you've got to shrink the company or put new blood in some places, and that's awful for everybody involved. So there's a lot of downsides to successfully turning a brand around. There's a lot of disruption to people and families and all of those things. So we've had some really dark times and along the way, and I think our success is very young. We're going to have a nice year this year, and we should have a good year next year if we achieve what we've set ourselves out to do. But we have a long way to go before we reach the potential that we think this brand can have. So we're a long way from popping any champagne. And like you said earlier, as entrepreneurs, we don't celebrate. And I think the reason we don't is because if you're really an entrepreneur, or if you're really driven, you're not in it for the champagne, you're in it for the journey. And if ever you end up sort of quote unquote making it, people who think this way will just go and find something else broken and start again, because it's the sort of the hustle that we enjoy.
Yeah, and I come from a movie background, and every great character has this thing, wants versus needs. And I think you just outlined that for the character of the entrepreneur, like they all want success, but they really need that journey. They need that challenge, and they don't realize that probably until at some point, they have a moment. But
so I wouldn't ever position myself as, look at what a success I am. I would say this is a work in progress. We've taken some risks. I think that's something I would be proud of, I guess, is we took some risks. They paid off so far. We've failed as much as we've succeeded, and our story is not by any means written yet. So it's an ongoing process.
Well, yeah, and that leads me to ask, what's next for KSWISS? Like, what are you most excited about?
Well, I think we've got some great partnership programs coming out with some really interesting properties. We're leaning into the 90s trend, and we've got some great, got a couple of movie collaborations coming out from 90s movies. I think will be really fun. We've got more Gary V's shoes coming out. We're moving forward with that. So we've just launched the 003 this year. So next year will be the 004. We're planning the launch of the 004. So that'll be exciting. That continues to build in momentum, the Gary V partnership. And then we've also got some other shoes for entrepreneurs that are more purpose-built for the entrepreneur lifestyle, which I'm really excited about. So we spend a lot of time at our local WeWork talking to entrepreneurs about, how they operate, what they do, what they need. And we've sort of taken those nuggets and built a product brief, and that should be coming out next year as well. So a lot of things. And then even in our North Star of tennis, the game of tennis, we made huge strides in our tennis business. Our tennis shoes now are, I think we just moved ourselves into the number 3 share position. I think we were number 5 or 6 when we started a couple of years ago. And we're going from strength to strength. We're closing in on number 2 in the tennis businesses from a share position, and our shoes are really getting good. So yeah, there's just tons going on.
Super exciting. And we'll make sure to link to all those resources and links in our show notes and make sure people have the opportunity to get their own pair of K-Swiss. And so that'll be really, really exciting. And so as we come to a close here, Barney, a question that we ask everyone on the show is, what would the 20-year-old you say if they ran into you today?
I think, first of all, they'd say, what the hell are you doing in America? That wasn't part of the plan. I've been here 20 some years now. And they'd probably be really proud of my family. They'd probably look at my wife and my kids and be like, man, that is everything you ever dreamed of. Honestly, that's the way I feel.
That's so great. My 20-year-old self, if I were a president of a shoe company, would be like, I can't believe you sell shoes. That's so cool. Yeah, that could be number 3. Well, Barney, thank you so much for coming on. It was great. And I really appreciate you taking the time. Like I said, we'll link to everything, all K-Swiss in the show notes, and make sure people have an opportunity to purchase some of these shoes for the entrepreneurial lifestyle.
Great. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it.
Wow. Thanks, Barney. I felt like there were 20 gold nuggets in that interview. And if you're wondering how to take on that 800-pound gorilla in your industry, and I doubt the brands that you are competing against are bigger than Nike and Under Armour and Adidas, Barney just gave you the formula. And I also love hearing how K-Swiss is leaning into its own backstory, heritage American tennis, and finding new opportunities and markets while never forgetting how they got here, and more importantly, who they are. After our interview, we got to talking, and Barney graciously offered to send me a pair of K-Swiss. I've never received anything from an interview before, nor do I expect to, but a few days later, a pair of Gary V signature shoes in the Dark Clouds model arrived at my house, and they now have worked their way into my regular rotation. Awesome shoes for anyone who's listening. Thank you, Barney, for my Dark Clouds. I love them. Well, thanks for listening. That's our show for today. Until next time. Make sure to visit our website, www.wildstory.com, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, or via RSS, so you'll never miss an episode.
I like big stories and I cannot lie. You other storytellers can't deny. Baby got backstory.
You'll also find free story downloads and resources to help you integrate the power of story into your business.